thank you so much for coming on the Mindful Mama podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, we've established that you have kids, so they have siblings. I'm wondering about, what you got you so interested in studying siblings and if it had anything to do with your own sibling relationships.
Uh, Actually, did not in an overt sense, but I like the question because it's a great way to get into the topic of siblings. No, the way I got into it was I was a doctoral student, and when you're a doctoral student, all you do is read, read, read. And so I'm reading all this family literature, and I came across two findings which really caught my attention. The first one, which is really fascinating, and I'm going to guess we'll end up talking a little bit about this, is that if you take two random pairs of strangers off the street and you give them a personality test and you give them psychological adjustment test, which is anxiety and depression and those kinds of things, and then you give siblings the same tests, that the siblings will score as different as random pairs of strangers.
Wow.
When I first came across this, I went, no way could that be true because siblings are all the same. Like we have so much similarity. We grow up in the same household, typically with the same parents and the same economic circumstances, exposed to the same good times and bad times, live in the same geographical regions, go to the same schools, eat the same
Same
food.
music, the same.
Yes, all of that, plus genetics alone should explain greater
Yeah.
similarity than random pairs of strangers. So at the end of this article, which was called Why Are Siblings So Different, written by biogeneticists, it said something, not in these words, but paraphrasing, maybe somebody with a family background can figure this out. So I said, geez, maybe that would be something I could learn more about. And so I've sort of dedicated a lot of my time to that very question about why are siblings so different from each other despite having all this sameness in their life. And that was the first thing that got me interested in siblings. And the second, which is a little bit darker, I, the research finding that's been consistent is that the number one form of abuse of children is perpetrated by a sibling, and it outnumbers parent abuse of children and peer bullying and partner battering combined. Like it's extremely common. And as somebody who'd been a therapist for a number of years at this point, had a graduate degree, was in the field, I was like, how did I not know this? Because typically we don't talk about it or get trained in that. And so those are the two things that really kind of said, wait, I got to learn more about this whole sibling thing. And it's also, at the time, and still is, an exceptionally understudied area of human development and human behavior. And in fact, it looks like siblings are more influential in regard to who we are than anybody else in our life. If you had different siblings, you'd be a different person. And
Yeah.
but again, it's not on people's radars that the such a powerful influence in our daily lives are siblings.
I certainly wouldn't like the cure as much as I do without my brother, that's for sure.
If positive and negative influence, we'll put that in the positive category.
Yeah, we'll put that in the positive category. I mean, I guess I could kind of understand that abuse thing in the way that you are if you're as different as you say we are, right? Like we're these completely different people, as different as two random strangers. We're thrown together, in a family where we're sort of competing for resources, right? We're competing for attention, and some things are more competitive than the others. So there's I guess, in a marriage, you've chosen to be together at some point, even though there's a lot of abuse in marriage. You have chosen to be together, right? And in other relationships, you've chosen to be together. So there isn't that element of like we chose each other ever, really, for siblings. So I could see how that maybe could be the result. That's sad.
Yeah, I don't know of a case yet where somebody gets to choose their sibling, but what an interesting thing that would be.
Yeah. So, well, before we how have your siblings shaped you?
I have one sibling, he's a younger brother.
Mm.
Well, we were both athletes, but he was a much better athlete than I. And so, in sort of carving out our identities, I continued to play sports, but I made more of my identity as a musician in the arts as he continued in sports. And probably if I had had a sibling that was not as talented athletically, I may have pursued sports a little bit harder.
And this is one of the ways maybe that siblings affect each other, right? Is that we're kind of getting our niches, right? Like if one is more athletic than one might actually, I mean that my brother is very athletic and I'm very artsy too. So I'm not sure maybe those are our niches as well.
What a coincidence that we're both here talking about siblings.
So yeah, so these are some of the ways we affect each other. How else do you said that we have some of the most effect on who we become as person? Sorry, Alex, you really need to edit that question because I just came out really badly. You said that siblings have some of the most effect on us, who we become as people in the future. So, what are some of the ways that siblings affect each other?
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple. The first one that you already identified is that we choose particular areas of expertise, so niches. So you have if a child decides, for example, well, let's say the older child is playing basketball, and the parents are very excited about it. They go to the games, they cheer. The child wins trophies. People are talking about the child. That the younger sibling is watching all of this, and they go, "Oh, I want to play basketball too." Right? So they want to follow in their footsteps. And then one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to be, as good or better than their sibling, and they're going to, really kind of achieve. And then all of a sudden everybody's like very excited about the younger sibling. And oh my gosh, they're so talented. And they have to be on the all-star team and look at that trophy. And the older sibling's like, you know what? There's not as much of a payoff in this anymore because I'm getting outshone, if that's the correct word, by my younger, smaller sibling. Or the younger sibling is going to say, is not going to have the same experience or be as talented and go, this isn't as much fun as it looked. There's not much of a payoff in this. And then let me carve out my identity somewhere else. And so they end up choosing very different paths. And then those paths are not inconsequential. So if somebody's athletic and that gets reinforced, they meet different people than artsy people meet. And they have different friends and they have different social circles and they go to different majors and they end up in different careers and they couple up with different kind of spouses and it has this major impact. So, it what seems like just a fairly small shift in focus or maybe to where we're most talented has a lot to do with what our siblings choose. It's if you have an exceptionally talented, for example, like we were using the example of a basketball player, and you decide, okay, I'm not going to play. You've made a choice to kind of avoid that the whole basketball enterprise. But at the same time, if you had a different sibling, one that was not athletic, you may have continued to pursue that, and who knows where that would have taken you.
Yeah, yeah, it could have been the thing for you, right?
It could be the thing
Yeah,
for you. Yeah, and
yeah,
so it shapes you in so many different ways, these kind of like small earlier choices in how siblings function. And so much of that has to depend it depends on, the parents and what they decide to do too, because some families are like you all have to do the same thing. You're all going to play football or you're all going to play field hockey or you're all going to be artists. And that shapes the way people interact within those niches. And so sometimes you'll meet a team where it's like meet a team. You'll meet a family where they have like three siblings who all play soccer and all do very well in soccer, but you'll see that they choose different niches or niches within soccer. One will be a goalie, one will be a striker, one will be a defender, and so on. You rarely see two people in exactly the same position. And it's why people like, the Mannings, who are both quarterbacks, are such exceptions to the rule. You don't see that so often, but there's definitely a culture of football in that family that would put everybody together in the same sport, in the same position.
I mean, it almost. I mean, I have of course, and I asked my team members about what do you want to know about siblings? I'm talking to Dr. Caspi. We have a lot of questions about how to cultivate good relationships. So I want to get to those, but it's thinking about a little bit on what you just said. It almost seems like it might be like a good strategy for parents to be like, we are all doing this, like if the parents are into football or the parents are into what, like we are all doing this, and really like making a strong encouragement for everybody to do the same thing, because then at least culturally you'd have this kind of bonding element as a family like a team does. Does that, I don't know, what do you think about that idea?
If only it were so simple.
I know, I know. I'm saying it as if it's just an easy choice.
Because not all kids are talented or good at the
Yeah.
same thing. We all, we're all very different from each other. And so, if you're not a painter and your family's like everybody's got to paint, it puts you at such a disadvantage because if you think about, who parents invest in, they're not, if you're the bad painter in a painting culture family, you might get the least amount of attention and investment and reinforcement. So it may not be such a good move for that child. I think helping children find their own paths and their own talents despite their siblings parent talents, just because your brother's a superstar soccer player doesn't mean that you can't play soccer and also excel at it. Is a different discussion, than a forcing discussion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and also since we're differentiating each other, and what you know what we want to do as siblings when we're kids, does it end up that if the older child is maybe very responsible or compliant or obedient, does that sort of birth order those does it end up that the maybe the middle child or the second child might niche and be not quite as responsible because the older sibling has that covered?
Yes, so there's interesting research on this too. First of all, just to give background to the answer I'm about to give you to that question, and it's related to your prior question, is the other thing is that siblings don't want to be like each other.
Hmm.
And they actively try to be different. The term is called de-identification. They really work to develop their own identities. And so I teach at a university, and I ask my students every semester who wants to be like their sibling, and almost nobody raises their hand because they all want to be themselves. Sometimes they do if they have a sibling who's like much older and accomplished. But one of the interesting things to answer your question about how siblings function with each other in birth order role is that the closer they are in age, the more different they are. The more age spacing, the more similarity you get. And so you have this process of active de-identification. And so you even see it in little kids where you take them to the ice cream truck and one's like, I'll have chocolate. And the other one's like, well, then I'll have vanilla. And you're like, but you love chocolate ice cream. And they're like, well, vanilla is my new favorite now. Right? And that's just a small like example of what happens in much bigger ways with families. And so you get this greater differentiation in close age. You also get, which is interesting, more closeness often because they're around each other a lot and have more of the same shared interests than you do with, say, wide age spacing, but you get more conflict too.
Mm.
And so, just like your niche question earlier, the more kids are in the same area, the more they're going to compete. And so, you're going to get more conflict too. And it's not that competition or conflict is inherently bad, it's how it's managed, but you just expect more of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, because of course we all want our kids to be close, and that whole, how far apart in age should they be question is a big one. Yeah, my neighbor is contemplating this. Her first daughter is like going on 2, and she's like, I want them to be. My daughters are 3 years apart, almost exactly to the week, and they're pretty good friends at this point. Like they're 14 and 17. They do some similar scouts venturing things, and they're different people, but they are friends. And my neighbor's like, I want them to be close, like your daughters, and like what I have to figure out the optimal age separation for having child number 2 if we have child number 2. And I'm like, I don't know, now I can point her to this closer but more conflict the closer in age they are.
Well, I mean, that's just a general rule for a lot of relationships is that when you're close, you're more likely to get bump into each other, right?
Sure, yeah.
And when
Yeah,
you're
that makes sense.
when you're close in age, and particularly if you're both of the same sex, like you have two daughters, they tend to gravitate towards the same kinds of things, and so there's more opportunities to have disagreements. And so the your friend who's choosing about optimal age spacing, age spacing is only one tiny, tiny component of the whole equation. And there's so many other things to consider about how do you develop close relationships than how many years apart they are. I mean, maybe your friend is lucky this way, but a lot of families aren't so talented that they can decide exactly how many years that their kids are apart from each other. Yeah.
Yeah, There's plenty of oops in that equation, I'm sure.
Yes, exactly. And then there's, and even though there can be wide age spacing, it tends to have less closeness in terms of like friendship. There's other kinds of closeness too. And so, like caretaking closeness and so
Mm-hmm.
on. So, all of it has its pros and cons. It has much more to do with how the family manages those differences.
Okay, so let's dive into that. And I'm wondering maybe if we should talk about first, like, kind of what not to do. And I think there are probably some maybe not so skillful practices from the past that maybe may arise here. You tell me, what should parents not do if we're wanting to have our kids be have connected, close relationships?
Oh, well, I'll start with something that's going to sound kind of funny, and then we'll get to strategies. The first one, and this is a big one, and it's a hard one for parents, is the research on parents' involvement in their kids' lives is typically the more involvement, the more fighting. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Because the ways parents typically get involved
That
actually
makes a lot of sense to me. Yes, go ahead, keep going.
actually exacerbate the fighting for multiple reasons. I mean, the big reason is that anybody who has a third person in the middle of their relationship makes that relationship less close. Just think about your significant others or your spouses. If there was somebody else trying to manage your relationship, it would be worse because you'd have somebody either translating or speaking on your behalf or taking sides. There'd be all kinds of messes that would happen, and that's why.
You'd complain to that person. He didn't do this thing. I'm so annoyed. Yeah. Hmm.
And that's
Yeah.
exactly what happens, right? The kids come running over to the parents and they complain about their sibling, and now the parent has a choice. Like, all right, what do I do with this information? And one of the things that is very frequent in a lot of families is that when parents do get involved, particularly they wait till the last minute to get involved. They wait until the kids are fighting. So you can have two kids who are in a room playing with each other really nicely, and the parents like, oh, that's great. Now I get to do work or wash dishes or whatever other tasks they have going on, and they're thrilled about it. And then when the screaming starts, that's when they get involved. And so when they get involved during the conflict, a couple things happen. One is that you're trying to handle it on the fly, and they don't really have any plan for what they're going to do so they end up saying things like just be nice to each other or go to you're older, you should know better. And all of those things actually make the sibling relationship worse. If you send kids to their rooms, what you've taught them is stay away from each other, which doesn't
Hmm.
build closeness, it just is avoidance. If you say be nice to your younger sister, you're older, you should know better, you've just taken the younger one's side and now and made an outsider of the older one, which builds more resentment and then fosters more conflict and more aggression, right? And why can't you just you two be nice to each other? It's almost like a ridiculous statement, right? it,
Just blaming them both.
yeah, it doesn't teach anything. It doesn't give them new strategies. It doesn't. Plus, and this is really important, and I think this is really important for anybody listening to this, is that they were playing together nicely for 20 minutes before they started yelling, and that's the thing that requires the attention. If you can go in and say, "Man, I love how you two are playing with each other so nicely, and how you're sharing, and and point that you like how you're
Hmm.
each other," and then you can walk out and then you come back in and you reinforce it again. Behavior gets your
Yeah. You need to have some kind of strategy. All of those are they're terrible. Yeah. Why can't you just be nice to each other? What does one say to that? Well, mother, because right now my fight, flight, or freeze stress response is activated, and therefore I cannot use my thinking brain. Right? Like no kids can.
exactly.
This is not going to happen. So it's important to understand this. And I think this is so like what you were saying before. The closer in age you are, the more conflict you have. If you want your kids to have close relationship, that means they spend time together. They're going to be in conflict. And sometimes I think that we want to avoid a lot of parents want to avoid all conflict, but to be in a relationship is to have conflict with each other. And like we're going to have conflict with our kids, we're going to have conflict with our parenting partners, we're going to have conflict with the people in our lives who are close to each other. So we need a strategy to be able to handle this conflict that we can deal with, and we also need to teach our kids a strategy for handling conflict they come into with each other. I imagine you're nodding, you're agreeing with this. Yeah.
Yeah, all of that is true. You know, the belief is that siblings are always fighting with each other over parental attention or favoritism or that, but most of the fighting that happens between siblings is just living together. You
Mm.
know, it's having to share the same space. It's the same thing that happens between couples when they live together and they run into conflict. It's not like you're fighting over your in-laws' attention. I mean, maybe some families are, but it's more just the day to day. Like I wanted to go here on Thursday afternoon and you want to go there, and which way are we going? Or I washed the dishes the last 5 days and you've done nothing, and I feel like I'm being taken advantage of. It's typical just kind of living together stuff. And I do a lot of couples counseling, and what I often say to couples is it's not that we don't have a goal that we want to stop fighting. You're always going to get into some conflicts because that's just the nature of relationships. It's how quickly you can manage it so that it doesn't linger, and how to let go of little things and kind of address the bigger things. And so it's the same thing to some degree with siblings, which is you're going to expect that there's going to be conflicts. To think that your children are not going to fight with each other is fantasy. Now, not all kids do. Right. There are some that have learned, that either it's their personalities or the culture of the family, and they don't go at each other that often. And some are at each other all the time. So the ones that are at each other all the time are the problem situations. And that's typically this. And typically, what happens is how the parents then get involved with this constant bickering or fighting and those things is exacerbating and not reducing it. If
Mm.
any parent tries to reduce a behavior and it doesn't go away in a couple weeks, or change, I should say, they're now in on it. They're part of the whatever's happening.
That's good to understand for ourselves, is am I helping this situation, or am I hindering it? And I imagine kids are learning. I mean, everything is modeling, right? Like we're always modeling for them all the time. So I imagine they're learning their conflict resolution skills from their parents, right? So if mom and dad start yelling and bossing each other around, or bossing the kids around, then the kids are going to do that with each other. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of it is, you're correct, is modeling. And if parents are not resolving their conflicts or just yelling at each other, it doesn't demonstrate a lot. But also, children, especially young children, don't have a lot of relational skills, and they don't have a lot of higher order cognitive skills to make sense of, to really understand what's going on. And so you do see some behaviors that are very different from adults than you do with children. Kids often hit each other and push each other down and rip things out of the other person's hand, and so on. And you do see that in adult couples, but not as much as you do with little kids. And those moments are great teaching moments, and a lot of that is just developmental.
Yeah, I can remember being really perplexed because I was like, why are they hitting? Like, they're not seeing that at all in the family. So, what can parents, like, when kids are fighting, what should parents do?
Well, one thing is, if we could back up to what you said a minute ago, is that being prepared, like having strategies, is helpful. And so, what you want first and foremost is you and your parenting partner to be on the same page and have a similar approach. Because if you don't, you can very easily end up undermining the other person's authority. And so, you want to be together and you want to have a plan. So, if you know that conflict is happening a lot, you can come up with, what do we do if it happens? And if the kids are very young, you can have this conversation first with your significant other or co-parent, and then you can say, these are the things we expect to see from you when you're interacting with each other and when you're fighting with each other, and you make the rules for what they're supposed to say. And then after you have those clearly laid out, you either meet with the children or you develop these together with the children. And then when it happens, if somebody, say, shoves the other person, and you say, no, we said there's no shoving, what do you do if you want to play with a toy and the other person's not sharing? And different families are going to have different approaches for that. It might be ask politely. It might be, can I play with it in 5 minutes? And it might be asking for a parent to help with that. And then the rule for the other person is to say, I will let you play with this when I'm done with it, which, may be in a few minutes. So, can you please wait a few minutes, and then I'll be happy to give it to you. You give them some sort of direction about how to behave. And then when they do it, you just praise the hell out of it and reinforce it. And when they don't do it, you say to them, remember the rules, remember what we talked about. and then you say, let's try again.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you give them an opportunity to do it again, and then you can praise it. And if they don't, you may, for some children, have to lay out some consequences, and for some children, they don't require that. So it depends on how much they push back on things.
You're basically saying teach them what they need to learn in this situation, right? Like I need to learn how to interact with my siblings, so you got to teach them very explicitly how do we do this, right? Like when your brother runs away with the cheese grater, say, hey, I would like the cheese grater back, whatever it is. That was a Q&A that was submitted here to the podcast.
Oh my God. There is another rule, by the way, which is if anything is dangerous,
Yeah, yeah.
you have to intervene quickly.
Yeah, yeah.
If a child's punching another child, you can't be like, well, parental intervention makes it worse. You have to get in and keep your kids safe. And cheese graters could do some damage.
Cheese grater could be damaging. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm glad you concur. That was my advice. I said I think that this is one for the adults to step in on, was the cheese grater.
absolutely. It's like running around with a knife.
Watch out for that hacksaw, honey.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we can step in when our kids are fighting and we can give them some tools. We can practice those tools. And what I also heard in what you're saying is that you're not being punitive, right? You're not saying, what's wrong with you for making a mistake and messing up? You're just saying, okay, we got to just try it again, right? Like, and what I'm hearing in what you're saying that's underneath the surface is that the parents need to be regulated. They need to not be adding a bunch of fuel to this fire. They need to be kind of downplaying it, right?
It's so much easier to regulate your own emotions when you have strategies and you have a plan.
Mm.
Because if you know these are the steps I'm going to do, then you feel more confident in the way you intervene. If you're winging it, you're much more likely to scream and feel overwhelmed, and then the children don't respond, and then it just escalates. So, emotional regulation is an internal strategy, but having a plan is always the best way to learn to regulate. For folks, for example, like you were mentioning before, who struggle with anxiety, if you have a plan for the thing that's causing you to worry, that you think is dangerous, you're much more confident in going in than just winging it. And it's the same thing for parents when they're with their children. The more you have strategies for yourself, and that requires you taking the time to have conversations about what is it going to look like, how am I going to intervene? How am I going to give them another chance and not be like, nope, you messed up. You're done. Go to your room. But rather like, okay, you're angry right now. Take a deep breath. Take a minute. Calm down. Now come back to it and try again. That now you have things that are much more likely to go well and that you can reinforce. And you walk out of it feeling good, and they walk out of it feeling good, and nobody walks out of the screaming feeling particularly good.
No, no, no one does. All right. So have some strategies. Implement your strategies as calmly as you can.
Try again. Big one.
Try again. Try and try again. Begin anew all the time. Okay, then how can we, other than those moments of conflict, can we cultivate them getting together? I remember wanting my girls to be not hate each other. That was my goal, is I want them to not hate each other. And, I had a book about sisters, and I would talk about how they're lucky to have their sisters, different things like that. I don't know if that was right. You tell me. What can we do to have kind of cultivate warmth and connection between them?
Well, I mean, clearly it was right, and you've done a lot well because you said that they are friends.
They are. Yeah.
And that's great. That's a really nice thing. And so, I mean, the evidence is the best evidence, right? So there's a few things, and some of them are don'ts, and some of them are do's. So we can run through that as well.
Great.
Don't take sides. Right. As soon as if you go in and say you're older, you should know better, you're the big sister, that only builds resentment, and resentment builds distance in relationships. So that's a no-no, right? You're not defending one against the other. The second is the more parents compare their children, the more competition is fostered and a sense of winning and losing, and mom likes you better, dad likes you better, whoever the parent is, and that leads to resentment. And so we try to focus on individual behaviors, not comparing to brothers and sisters, which is very hard to do because they want to compare themselves to each other too. And then, of course, you have teachers and coaches and everybody else, grandparents and cousins, all doing this comparison. But the more you minimize that, the less that you foster this sort of like, that's my rival and I don't want to lose. especially if it's the comparisons are high price comparisons. Like we were talking about earlier, if like you're from a family that is like super into football and you have one child who's great at football and the other child who is not interested or doesn't want to play, it very quickly can become, well, you like that one better than me because they're a football player and you don't appreciate art, but that's what I want to be. And so now you feel like an outsider in your own family. And so that also cultivates greater distance, right? So if there are these high price comparisons, that will create more distance in relationships. Sending people to their rooms and telling them to stay away from each other creates apathy in relationships and distance. It doesn't build closeness. And so, all those things I would avoid. Reinforcing the positive moments, telling them how great they are together, giving them opportunities to have shared experiences, and even on neutral ground shared experiences. Sometimes vacations are the absolute worst things for families because all rules and all bets are off and everybody's tired and stressed, and so there's a lot of fighting. But it also creates nice opportunities for shared experiences that they aren't having with peers, for example, or other people. Yeah, helping them learn pro-social skills such as complimenting and praising and showing interest, advice giving, being able to go to your sister or your brother and saying like, "How do I do this? This is not something I can talk to mom and dad about. It's too embarrassing." Like, how do you know how to kiss somebody the first time? Those kind of things that you don't talk about with parents. All those things cultivate closeness. And, this might sound almost cliche at this point, but getting kids off their phones,
Mm.
because that really builds a lot of disengagement into relationships too. The siblings end up very much in their own social circles, in their own place on the phone, and they could be sitting next to each other on the couch and not know each other at all. And so they have to have opportunities to have shared experience. And also, if they fight and they resolve it, that actually makes people closer.
Yeah, yeah. These are great. Yeah, I love that. I was thinking about all the vacations and how when we encountered our first climbing wall and all these different experiences, and when we hiked that hill and then we were almost blown off by wind and all these different things. Yeah, I think those are really wonderful. And yeah, and the whole idea of just kind of sometimes I think of it as like a campaign to catch them in the good times, right? Like what you're saying, like reinforce the positive things, like, oh, thank you. I appreciate you being so kind to your sister or whatever it is. Those I think are really great. What do we do? This question came from my team member. What do you do? How do you address it if one sibling gets upset and says, I hate my younger sister?
It's a good question. There are going to be those moments.
Mm-hmm.
And, sometimes as you said, the person you never had a choice in being in your life is somebody that you don't particularly share interests with or has a very different personality. But more often it's related to feeling like the presence of your sibling is either overshadowing yours, right? That there's some favoritism that's happening. And so that sibling makes you look bad or is winning parental favor. And sometimes it's that the person that's hated is able to get away with things. So it's like a violation of boundaries and personal space. So they go in and borrow the sweater without asking. Or they share a private moment publicly that's supposed to be kept private within the family, and those feel like violations. And this builds up this like feeling of like I really dislike this person. It doesn't have to be a permanent state of affairs to feel like you're always in that place. And so, what I tell parents is that when kids say things like that, you have to take it seriously. And actually, not in the heat of the moment, not when kids are like really heated up, but, to come back after they've calmed down a little bit and said, can we talk about that? That's a really powerful statement. And, I don't think that you want to hate your sibling, and I certainly don't want you to hate each other. So tell me what you think is going on. And to be open to feedback that your child might say, well, because you guys favor and like him or her more, and I hate that. And not to go, no, 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 I love you all the same, and dismiss it. Because if you dismiss it, it only makes them feel even more like an outsider.
And
So
not want to tell you more.
exactly. So take it seriously and treat it like it's real. And I'm not saying like if it's a one-time explosion and it's like super dramatic, that you can let that go. But if it seems to be like you're hearing it regularly, then something's up. right? And so why not put it on the table and really try to understand it and not try to rationalize the child out of it? Like, well, it's just because you don't understand, right? It's, actually listen to what they're saying.
And, from your warning earlier, like there could be stuff going on. Yeah, like this is the relationship in which it's maybe most likely to be happening. So let's, be open to understanding, as uncomfortable as that may make us feel. I guess I would say, like, if the kid said to me, like, I hate my younger sister, I guess I would just, I don't know, validate that or empathize with that first. Like, wow, you're so mad right now. You're really frustrated with them, right? And just then see kind of what happened there, in as far as what to do in the heat of the moment.
Yeah,
Like,
oh, that's great.
that is
Yeah,
coming up.
100%. You want your children to feel like you're their advocate and ally, and not like you're there to defend the other child or to just to say why are you being so dramatic and over the top and those kinds of things, because that will only make things worse in the big picture. And you're 100% right. Just taking the time out to validate it and show some empathy is a great place to start.
There's so much here. I think I didn't get. I have all this huge list of questions I didn't get to ask you. Anyway, I guess it means maybe we'll have you come back on again some other time. But
That would be great. I teach courses on at the university on siblings, and it's like 15 weeks an hour and 3 hours a pop or something like that. It's hard to get it all in an hour.
I guess it
Yeah.
is. I guess it is. Well, this has been so fascinating and interesting. I think anybody who has multiple kids or who has siblings themselves, like it's so interesting to kind of think about these very special relationships. I think on the positive side, it can be this great relationship that you can have for life, right? Like with somebody that's kind of in your life forever. And that's my hope for my kids. So hopefully some of these strategies will help people do that.
What you said is critically important, and I don't want that to get lost on anybody. The area of positive sibling relationships and its effect on humans over the lifespan is incredibly impressive. This sounds nutty when I say it, but there is research on this that siblings are in adulthood the number one predictor of happiness is a good relationship with a sibling, longevity, because if you think about how isolated people get towards the end of life, having a close sibling relationship can make a huge difference. So related to that is better health. People have better relationships with their spouses if they have good relationships with their siblings. They do better at work. They get promoted more. They make more money. Like
Wow.
it's got a lot of amazing developmental benefits. And to make it to even reinforce it further, and this is really what I think is fascinating, is that a good relationship with with your sibling in childhood acts as a buffer for very difficult events that happen in life. So, for example, when parents get divorced and kids really struggle, you know, uh, they end up doing generally okay, but in the beginning they fall behind academically and behaviorally and those kind of things for a short window of time. But if they have a good relationship with a sibling, you don't see that. And so it really buffers these negative effects in very, very powerful ways. And that's because you have somebody who understands you and is shared witness and you can commiserate with. It's extremely powerful. And so people with poor relationships actually do worse on all the same things that I just said. So it's not just stopping the bickering, in the house so that you can have a more peaceful house. You want to create an environment where your siblings develop, real closeness and friendships and can support each other through the course of the life cycle because it has incredible benefits the entire way through.
Okay, so would you, as your kids are old enough to understand some of that, would you share some of that with them? I mean, I remember talking to Maggie and Sarah about like, yeah, when friends will come and go in your life, and your sister will be there forever, and they're going to be there for you if you guys are kind to each other. Like, would you do that?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even you can create some of that early on by if a child comes to you and says, I'm having trouble with a kid at school who's kind of being mean to me. What do I do? You can say, you know what? Your sister, or your brother had something similar happen. Why don't you go ask for some advice there? And have them have those kind of serious conversations and help to advise if the older sibling handled it in an appropriate way. If they did, that's a different story. And you could still provide guidance as a parent, but you can bring you can bring their brothers and sisters into it, so you can foster those moments too.
Oh wow, that's awesome. I'm so glad you jumped in. Well, I was going to ask you, is there anything that we missed that you would like to share with the listener? And tell us also, you have several books, and tell us where we can find you, the listener can find you if you want to take the conversation further.
Well, thanks for asking. Yes, I have a book just out now called Raising Loving Siblings. That's out on, you can find it on all the online booksellers, not hard to find. And I have a website, which I'm not the greatest at updating, but I do get there, and it's siblingexpert.com.
There are some fascinating articles from 2014 there.
Yeah, you're killing me. There's actually a good one. I think I'm gonna try to update it later today. There's an interesting new research out on which kids parents tend to favor, because most parents do have children that they favor, even though it's such a taboo subject. And it's an interesting thing. So I'll get that up there on there.
Good. See, that's going to be a teaser for us by the time this podcast is out. We can go to, say the website again,
Siblingexpert.
siblingexpert.com, and find that. John, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it.